One of the most misunderstood aspects of being an empath is that what eventually becomes a source of power often begins as a source of confusion. Many empaths spend the first half of their lives not developing themselves, but adapting themselves. They become experts at reading rooms before they learn how to read their own needs. They can sense tension before a word is spoken, detect disappointment behind a smile, and feel the emotional atmosphere of a relationship almost instantly. Yet despite this extraordinary awareness of others, they often remain disconnected from themselves. This is not because they lack self-awareness. In fact, many empaths are deeply reflective. The challenge is that their attention has been trained outward. From an early age, they learn to monitor the emotional states of the people around them. Sometimes this develops because they grow up in environments where emotional harmony feels essential to safety. Other times, it emerges simply because they are naturally sensitive and responsive. Regardless of the cause, the result is often the same. They become skilled at anticipating what others need, while becoming increasingly uncertain about what they themselves need. What makes this dynamic particularly complex is that society tends to reward it. The empath is praised for being thoughtful, caring, accommodating, and selfless. They become the reliable friend, the supportive partner, the person everyone turns to during difficult times. Their ability to hold space for others is admired, but admiration can sometimes disguise a deeper problem. When a person receives approval primarily for how well they serve the emotional needs of others, they may begin to believe that their value depends on maintaining that role. Over time, this creates a subtle but profound distortion. The empath starts measuring their worth through their usefulness. They become uncomfortable disappointing people. They struggle to say no. They carry responsibilities that do not belong to them. They absorb emotional burdens they were never meant to carry, and because they are so accustomed to focusing on others, they often fail to notice how depleted they have become. There is a philosophical paradox at the center of this experience. The very sensitivity that allows empaths to connect deeply with others can also prevent them from developing a deep relationship with themselves. They become fluent in everyone else's emotional language, while remaining strangers to their own inner voice. Many empaths spend years believing that love requires self-sacrifice. They confuse compassion with overextension. They assume that being a good person means always being available, always understanding, always giving one more chance. Yet, eventually, life presents a difficult lesson. No amount of empathy can compensate for the absence of boundaries. No amount of understanding can replace self-respect. This realization rarely arrives as a gentle insight. More often, it arrives through exhaustion, through relationships where their generosity is taken for granted, through friendships that feel one-sided, through moments when they look around and realize they have spent so much time caring for everyone else that they have neglected the person who needed their care the most. And yet this stage is not a failure, it is preparation, because before an empath can become powerful, they must first see clearly. They must recognize the difference between being connected and being consumed, between helping and rescuing, between kindness and self-abandonment. The early years are often an education in these distinctions. Painful at times, yes, but essential. What appears from the outside as vulnerability is often the beginning of wisdom. Every experience of emotional overload, every moment of disappointment, every realization that self-sacrifice has limits becomes part of a larger awakening. The empath begins to understand that sensitivity is not the problem. The problem is sensitivity without direction, compassion without boundaries, awareness without self-knowledge. If the first stage of an empath's life is characterized by adaptation, the second is defined by confrontation. This is the point where reality begins to challenge the beliefs that once seemed unquestionable. It is where the empath discovers that being deeply caring does not guarantee healthy relationships, that understanding someone's pain does not automatically create mutual respect, and that giving endlessly does not ensure receiving what one needs in return. For many empaths, this realization arrives through a series of experiences that feel deeply personal. A betrayal they never expected, a friendship they invested years into only to discover the effort was not reciprocated, a relationship where they repeatedly extended compassion, hoping their understanding would inspire change, only to find themselves carrying the emotional weight of two people instead of one. These moments hurt not simply because of what happened, but because they challenge the empath's fundamental assumptions about connection itself. What makes this stage so transformative is that the pain is not merely emotional, it is philosophical. It forces a person to reconsider how they have been relating to the world. The empath begins to ask difficult questions. Why do I feel responsible for emotions that are not mine? Why do I keep prioritizing understanding others while neglecting my own experience? Why do I feel guilty when I protect my time, my energy, or my peace? These questions mark the beginning of a profound shift. Because growth rarely starts with certainty, it starts with discomfort. It starts when the strategies that once helped us navigate life no longer produce the outcomes we seek. Many empaths spend years believing that if they love deeply enough, explain patiently enough, forgive generously enough, things will eventually improve. There is beauty in that hope, but there is also danger, because empathy, when disconnected from discernment, can become a pathway to self-neglect. It can lead someone to remain in situations long after they have become unhealthy, simply because they understand the reasons behind another person's behavior. Understanding, however, is not the same as acceptance. One of the most important lessons an empath eventually learns is that compassion does not require proximity. You can understand someone's wounds without allowing those wounds to dictate your life. You can care about someone's struggles without making them your responsibility. You can wish someone well while recognizing that their journey is not yours to carry. This realization often feels uncomfortable at first because it challenges an identity that has been built over decades. Many empaths unconsciously define themselves through their availability to others. Their worth becomes linked to how much they can give, how much they can tolerate, how much they can absorb. When they begin setting boundaries, it can feel almost unnatural. They worry about disappointing people. They fear appearing selfish. They question whether they are becoming less compassionate. In reality, the opposite is happening. For the first time, compassion is expanding to include themselves. A boundary is not an act of rejection. It is an act of clarity. It is the recognition that every human being has limits, and that respecting those limits is essential to genuine connection. Relationships do not become healthier when one person continually sacrifices themselves. They become healthier when both individuals are responsible for their own emotional lives. As empaths begin to embrace this truth, something remarkable happens. The exhaustion that once defined them starts to fade. The constant need for external validation loses its grip. They stop measuring their value by how needed they are and begin measuring it by how aligned they are with themselves. This is where inner authority begins to emerge. Instead of asking, "How can I make everyone comfortable?" they start asking, "What is true for me?" Instead of automatically absorbing the emotions around them, they learn to observe them. Instead of feeling responsible for every conflict, every disappointment, every unmet expectation, they develop the courage to let others own their experiences. This does not make them colder, it makes them wiser, because wisdom is not the absence of compassion. Wisdom is compassion guided by self-respect. And perhaps this is the paradox that changes everything for the empath. The boundaries they once feared would separate them from others are the very thing that allows authentic connection to flourish. The self-protection they once viewed as selfish becomes the foundation of genuine generosity. The pain they once tried to avoid becomes the teacher that leads them back to themselves. And this brings us to the stage that many empaths spend years unknowingly preparing for. After the confusion of the early years and the painful lessons of the turning point, something begins to emerge that is far more powerful than sensitivity alone. It is not a new personality. It is not a dramatic reinvention. It is the gradual integration of everything they have learned. What once felt fragmented becomes coherent. What once felt like a burden becomes a source of strength. This is why so many empaths come into their fullest power later in life, not because age itself creates wisdom, but because experience refines perception. Over time, empaths develop an understanding of human nature that cannot be taught in a book. They have spent years observing emotions, navigating relationships, witnessing contradictions, and learning the difference between what people say and what they truly communicate. They begin to recognize patterns that once seemed invisible. They understand that behavior often reveals more than words. They learn that confidence is not always strength, that vulnerability is not always weakness, and that the loudest voices in a room are not necessarily the most secure. The difference is that they no longer absorb everything they perceive. Earlier in life, an empath might walk into a room and unconsciously carry away the emotional atmosphere. Someone's anxiety became their anxiety. Someone's frustration became their frustration. Someone's sadness lingered long after the interaction ended. But maturity brings a critical distinction. They learn that awareness does not require ownership. This is one of the most liberating realizations a person can have. You can recognize another person's pain without becoming responsible for it. You can witness suffering without losing yourself inside it. You can remain open-hearted while maintaining a clear sense of where you end and another person begins. That boundary changes everything, because once emotional energy is no longer being consumed by constant absorption, it becomes available for something else. Creativity deepens, purpose becomes clearer, decision-making becomes stronger, relationships become more authentic. The empath is no longer reacting to life from a place of emotional overload. They are responding from a place of grounded awareness. And perhaps this is where true confidence begins. Not the confidence that comes from certainty, status, or external validation, but the confidence that comes from knowing yourself, knowing what you value, knowing what you will and will not tolerate, knowing that your peace is worth protecting, knowing that your sensitivity is not something to hide or apologize for. There is a quiet quality to this kind of power, and that understanding changes everything.